Today, Gitschin in Czech, or Gitschin in German, has about 17,000 people. In 1866, it had about 6,000, mainly Czechs. This pleasant town had had 1 decade of splendor in all of its history, plus another few days of importance later on. That decade came because Wallenstein, Count Albrecht von Wallenstein, or Waldstein, made this town the capital of his Duchy of Friedland during the 30 Years' War, when he was given that noble title and allowed to put together that principality of his own. This is Wallenstein's palace here. Today it includes the Municipal Museum. Along with this, the entire row of arcaded shops still here today were built during this time. Wallenstein built himself a treasury building and a mint for his own coinage, and a richly endowed Jesuit college over in that direction. Again, for his brief decade of fame, this was a splendid capital. All that came to an end with his murder in 1634. After that, the town sank back into obscurity. In 1813, it had its brief moment of fame. Emperor Franz of Austria stayed in Wallenstein's palace for 5 weeks, and it was here that the negotiations for the alliance that brought down Napoleon took place. Metternich, the Prussian Humboldt, the Russian ambassador Nesselrode, the Emperor Francis of Austria, Franz I. Again, they made some pretty crucial decisions right here. But in 1866, this town was to be the junction for the various troops, Saxon and Austrian First Corps, who would have to resist the Prussian advance coming their way. The Battle of Gitschin, or Gitschin, would be fought here north of the town and west of it. Much of it fought in this classic defensive position that the Austrian army had studied, had analyzed, had wargamed for over a century. Between the town of Eisenstadt, today's Železnice, over in that direction, and this town of Brada, a little village right below us here on this slope, you have the area where the main Austrian defensive line was placed. More of the defenders were back here behind us in some very high and very rugged terrain that we'll see shortly, as well as others even beyond this rocky cliff. But it was here on this hill overlooking Brada that Brigade Poschacher took up its position. The Prussians would be coming down from the north, coming from that way. Over at Eisenstadt, Brigade Piret held those lines. The center of this line would be at that low-lying village of Dilec, today's Dilce. It ought to have been held by the Saxons, but they weren't here yet. They were marching up from some distance away, still had a long ways to come. Their Crown Prince Albert was indeed the overall commander for this whole battle, but many of his troops were late getting here. An optimist would then say that they were the strategic reserve that would be thrown into the battle when they did finally arrive. But it would have been handy to have them at Dilec when the battle began. To make up for that, the Austrian guns, the Austrian artillery was placed down there. A line of 56 cannon covering the area between Dilec and Brada, the village right below the bushes that you see there. Two other Austrian brigades, as we'll see, on the high ground here, Brigade Abele, and then down on the highway coming in from the west, Brigade Ringelsheim, holding the threat, holding and guarding against the threat from the west in that direction. But much of the battle, the main effort against the Prussians, would be fought here. The Prussian army headquarters, and indeed most of the army itself, would not take part in this battle. The Prussian prince and his chief of staff found out later in the day that the battle had been fought, but it was conducted pretty much at the divisional level by the two Prussian divisions that came this way. Coming down from that direction through that pass, the 5th Division under General Karl von Trümpling. And from over on the far west, as we will see later, the Prussian 3rd Division under General von Werder. A threat from the north, a threat from the west. The course of this entire battle was going to be determined by orders from Benedek, orders from the main Austrian Army headquarters way back at Josefstadt. It was a 3.5-hour ride by courier to this point. But the crucial point, as we'll see, is that the orders that came up from Army headquarters were enormously delayed, ridiculously delayed. 2 o'clock in the afternoon of June 29th. The Prussians were not yet here. The Austrians were in position. Both Prince Albert and Clam Gallas, the Austrian First Corps commander, expected this to be the area where the main Austrian army would concentrate, felt that they needed to hold this line at all costs so as to enable the other Austrian corps to get here within the next day or so. And indeed, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, an order was brought in by a courier, handed over, seemingly confirming that. This was an order from Benedek giving a complete and detailed description of his army's projected advance up to here, up to Gitschin. The order had been drafted, though, about 2 days before. It had taken a leisurely courier 19 hours to reach Gitschin. Again, it should have been a 3.5-hour mission. The commanders here didn't know it, but this order did not reflect current plans. But it did determine them to make their fight here. 3:30 in the afternoon, the Prussians appeared. General Trümpling's division, coming in from the north, arrived. He deployed for battle. He knew that he was far ahead of the main army, but he knew also that Austrian reinforcements should be coming up, and he felt that an aggressive early attack might dislodge the defenders from this position. He knew also that Werder's division would be coming in from the west at any time. So he deployed for battle, launched what turned out to be a series of assaults on these Austrian positions. An attack here at Brada was repulsed. Another of his brigades moved around to face the rocky bulk of the Privisen, as we will see, and quite understandably made no progress there either. Artillery barrage against the Austrian gun line here was met by their own counter-battery fire. The Austrian gunners, as so often, did quite well. Fighting from these slopes up here, Poschacker's men fought effectively at this point, charged against the Prussians here at Brada and at Podolsy, right there behind it, and again held their lines quite well at this point. Poschacker tried one trick. The Prussian needle gun, of course, gave a huge advantage, but he ordered his line troops, 3 out of 4 of them perhaps, to do nothing but load rifles and pass them forward to his sharpshooters, the Jaeger battalion. In effect, that gave him the equivalent of the volume of fire that the Prussian needle guns could produce. But the cost of that, of course, was that only about 1/4 of his total strength could deliver that firepower. And still, it was a nice trick, and it worked at this particular point. On the Austrian right flank, over there at Eisenstadt, Piret's brigade was stationed, and the Prussians attacked there were held, although some of the Austrian defenders were less than enthusiastic. These, it seems, were Italian troops from Austria's Italian province, from down around Verona. Most of those Italians would much, much rather have been fighting as allies of the Prussians, as indeed the newly formed Kingdom of Italy was doing at that very same point. The Prussians later said that those Italians of the Veronese 45th Regiment had to be driven into the fight by their officers holding loaded revolvers at their backs. Needless to say, they didn't attack too aggressively. But still, these probing attacks by the Prussians lasted for a couple of hours, not making much progress. When Templing sent his 10th Brigade under General Kamiensky to make that flanking attack up into the rugged landscape on Poshacher's left, this is the kind of country he had to fight his way through, and the kind of hill he had to climb. Today, this whole area is a tourist attraction, quite rightly. The Český Ráj, the Bohemian paradise, or Czech paradise. The gateway to an area of beautiful woods, rock formations, lots of castles, both Renaissance and Baroque and ruined medieval. The castles weren't in this area, but the rocks, the woods, the slopes definitely were. Kamiensky and his men had hoped to outflank Poshacher up here, but the Austrians had posted a full brigade back here along these heights, Vincenz von Abele's brigade. And when the Prussians began pushing up through these woods, coming about this far, the Austrians, Abele's Austrians, rushed forward in storm columns, as best they could keep their columns in shape in this kind of countryside, to repel this attack. There was hand-to-hand fighting here. There was a vicious battle before the Prussian 10th Brigade fell back, moved on back to the west then through the trees, ran into the rear of Poshacher's line, exchanged shots with them, found that line firm also, and then retired back out into the open country. The Prussians got about this far, and their memorial is here. In this case, the 1st Posen Infantry Regiment. One last one. This one to the memory of all of the brave soldiers who fell here on June 29th, 1866. This one was erected by Count Schlick in 1890. And this candle, like the flowers we saw elsewhere, indicates that someone comes to these with prayers. Here's where the Austrian left wing was placed. Ringelsheim's brigade held this high ground overlooking that main road coming in from Münchengrätz. And it was there that General Werder's Prussian division, the 3rd Division, would be coming late in the afternoon, around 6 o'clock, early evening actually. But he found this to be a very tough position to deal with. For almost 2 hours, Ringelsheim's brigade did quite well in resisting this Prussian advance. Werder's frontal assaults against the Austrians failed in these fields right here. And an attempt at flanking them also was met by the Austrian troops shifting to deal with that threat over in that direction. So here apparently Ringelsheim and his men were holding their own. The fighting was quite intense. The casualties in the Austrian lines were pretty heavy, but still this position was unshaken when, about 8 o'clock in the evening, orders arrived from Clam Gallus's headquarters to break off this battle, to disengage, to fall back, rejoining the main army at Gitschin. All this was totally unexpected, and why these orders were issued, we'll soon see. But in their fighting here, the regiments of Ringelsheim's brigade suffered pretty heavily. The 73rd Line Regiment, for example, leaving this memorial, lost more men here than they would lose in the Great Battle of Königgrätz 5 days later. Late in the day, the Prussians did take a key point, and that was that low-lying village of Dillets that you can see right down there. They could see in the distance clouds of dust. They knew that the Saxons must be coming up as fast as they could to occupy that center of the Austrian line. And 3 Prussian battalions lunged forward, trying to escape the artillery fire, lined up from the guns lined up on this side of Dillets, occupied the town in late afternoon. Trempling reinforced that first detachment, and so by 7:30 in the evening, there were 15 Prussian rifle companies down there, loading and firing their breech loaders as fast as they could, driving back the late arriving Saxons who showed up, engaged in a firefight right down there just south of Dillets, but could not retake the town. In effect, Trempling had driven a wedge into the center of this Austrian line. The Austrians were containing it, but they were under great pressure from all these other Prussian troops and from the events, as we'll see, in the west. It was at this critical point that a piece of paper showed up that decided the battle. This was another order from Benedek, delivered by a courier between 7:30 and 8 in the evening, handed over to Prince Albert. Prince Albert consulted Clamgallas and his own chief of staff. All of them were astonished at what this order said. This order had been drafted from Army headquarters. That delay was caused by the fact that there were 2 chiefs of staff at Benedek's headquarters. The new one, which had issued the orders, and the recently relieved favorite of Benedek, General Henigstein, who was still hanging around headquarters. He had been given the position of headquarters president, and one of his assignments was to handpick the couriers to deliver important messages. Henigstein took his time at doing that. Not until late in the day did he pick a Count Sternberg to deliver these orders. That's the way the Austrian army staff operated. But what the orders said fell upon this headquarters like a thunderbolt. Benedick wrote, "I find it necessary to call off my movement to the Yser today. In the course of this present day, the army will take the positions spelled out in the attached annex. Your Royal Highness of Saxony will direct your present movements with the objective of uniting with the main body of the army, and until this union is achieved, avoid any major encounters." The attached annex describing where the army was, where the army of the Yser was to go to join them, was nowhere to be seen. All that had been delivered was that single sheet of paper. But this battle ought not to have been fought. Prince Albert made the decision to disengage, to fall back as rapidly as he could. Some of his staff members argued against this. They felt that with the Prussian pressure still continuing, with the Prussians lodged there at Dillets, with the threat from the west coming in, that they should beat back this attack, should complete this battle, and then do a controlled withdrawal once the enemy had been rocked back and his advance halted. Prince Albert, though, insisted, no, orders are orders. We have to get out of here now. If we wait longer, we may lose this fight in any case. So the next problem was disengaging under pressure, under fire, with an unrelenting enemy continuing his attacks on the Austrian and Saxon lines. The Austrian cavalry division did what it could to delay the Prussians. Piret's brigade from over in Eisenstadt launched a few fairly feeble attacks against the Prussians to try to cover this withdrawal before they pulled out themselves. Again, not too effective on that part. But still, as the sun set, the Austro-Saxon line, in some confusion, in growing chaos, fell back towards Gitschin, where the chaos would get even worse. 9 o'clock at night on June 29th. This square in the center of Gitschin was a scene of mass confusion. The retreating Austrian and Saxon troops were pouring through this town and this square from the north and from the west. Prince Albert and Clam Gallas themselves conferred briefly, took position just outside the town to try to control this flow of traffic and to bring some order out of the confused retreat. The Austrian Ringelsheim Brigade was designated as the rear guard against the advancing Prussians, but it was too worn out to accomplish this task. And so the relatively fresh Saxon Life Brigade that had come up so late was given the job. But the Prussians were moving much more quickly than these retreating troops realized. They bore down upon the town. Werder's 3rd Division, coming in from the west, fought its way into the western suburbs, fought its way toward this central square. Pomeranian units broke into Gitschin from that direction around 11 o'clock at night. Clam Gallas and his staff did not handle this well. He seems to have panicked. He fled. His entire Austrian corps collapsed into confusion and panic, pouring out of this town towards the south. 11:30 p.m. The Saxon troops, that rear guard, entered the town from the south and at once attacked the Pomeranians, driving them out of the town. Firefight here in this square. Saxon victory, at least for a moment. Unlike the Austrians, the Saxons then kept their order, fell back out of the town unbroken, and marched off with their spirits unbroken as well, abandoning Gitschin to the Prussian victors. There behind Wallenstein's palace is St. James's Church, and that night and the next morning the victors met there. King Wilhelm of Prussia on the left, his son, the Crown Prince, in the center, Minister President Bismarck next to him.